The first thing I noticed was that my hands no longer obeyed me. My gloves had swollen stiff, my fingers barely brushing the switches on my chest. My legs felt like tree trunks. That was when I realized, I couldn't get back into the spacecraft. It was March 18, 1965. I had just floated out into open space, tethered to Voskhod 2 by a single lifeline. For 12 minutes, I saw the Earth like no human had ever seen it, a glowing blue world hanging in the black. I should have been the happiest man alive. Instead, I was panicking inside a ballooning spacesuit that was turning into my coffin. I tried to bend, twist, force myself toward the hatch. Nothing. The suit had expanded so much in the vacuum that I was like a child trapped inside a frozen puppet. My mind raced. If I can't get back through the airlock, this is how I die, drifting around my own spaceship, watching my commander close the hatch without me. I called out. "Pavel, I can't get through. The suit is too rigid." There was silence for a moment, then Belayev's calm but tight reply crackled in my headset. "Don't panic, Alyosha. We'll think of something." Easy for him to say. He was inside, strapped to life, while I was outside, fighting to stay alive in a suit that no longer belonged to me. The first sign that something was truly wrong came when I tried to reach for the cord that guided me back to the airlock. My arm refused to bend properly. I pulled harder, straining every muscle, but the suit was so inflated that my elbow locked at a useless angle. It was as though I was trapped inside a pressurized barrel, forced into a posture I could not change. I realized that I could float here and enjoy the view for as long as my oxygen lasted, but getting back inside was going to be another matter entirely. At first, I told myself it was just stiffness and that if I pushed harder, I would make it. I kicked against the tether and swung back toward the spacecraft, the hatch glinting in the sunlight like a perfect target. As I reached the rim of the airlock, I tried to pull myself inside. My helmet scraped against the frame and stopped me dead. I tried again from another angle, twisting and pulling, but my shoulders would not fit through. The realization hit me in waves, like ice spreading through my chest. I was outside my own ship, staring at the opening, and yet my body could not pass through. I called out to Pavel. My voice sounded controlled, but inside my head the panic was starting to claw at me. "The suit is swollen. I cannot enter. My shoulders will not fit." He answered quickly, but I heard the hesitation. "Do not rush. Stay calm. Tell me exactly what you feel." I explained that the suit was rock hard, the joints unmovable, and that I could not compress myself enough to fit inside. There was a silence, just a few seconds, but in that silence I heard every possible outcome, and none of them ended with me alive. Pavel finally spoke. "Alyosha, you must find a way. I cannot leave the ship." He did not need to say more. If I failed, he would be forced to seal the hatch and return alone. I tried again, ramming myself at the opening with all the force my legs could give. My helmet struck metal, my chest caught on the rim, and the airlock seemed to laugh at me with its unyielding shape. Sweat poured down my back, pooling in my boots. The inside of my visor blurred, and I felt the heat rising in my head. I was no longer floating free and calm, I was trapped in my own private furnace, each breath fogging the helmet, each heartbeat hammering against my ears. I heard ground control calling, voices distorted by the radio link. "Report status." I almost snapped back at them, but I forced myself to be brief. "Suit expanded. Cannot re-enter airlock." Their reply was cautious, professional, but useless. They could not do anything from Earth. The only man who could help me was sitting just 2 meters away, and even he was powerless. Minutes were passing. My oxygen gauge showed a steady decline, and I knew the calculations by heart. At this rate, I had perhaps 20 minutes before carbon dioxide buildup would cloud my mind. The thought was horrifying because it meant I might drift here, conscious at first, then slowly fading, listening to my friend's voice as he told me goodbye. I had trained for countless emergencies, but not for this exact scenario. The engineers had never predicted how the suit would behave in real vacuum. The longer I stayed outside, the more unbearable the heat became. The suit's cooling system was overwhelmed. Sweat was dripping into my eyes, stinging, making it hard to focus. I was breathing like a man who had run a marathon, gasping, sucking air that felt heavier with every minute. My heart was racing, not just from exertion, but from the simple knowledge that I was balanced on the edge of survival, with no easy solution in sight. I told Pavel again, if I continue like this, I will lose consciousness. The suit is too tight. I cannot bend. His answer came back steady, though I could hear the tension under his words. Then we must change something. Think. Do not waste strength. His calmness kept me from losing control completely, but it also sharpened the cruel reality. I could not fight my way in by brute force. I had to do something drastic. As I hung there, tethered to the ship, staring at the hatch that refused me, a thought formed that chilled me more than the vacuum ever could. The only way to reduce the suit's volume was to let air out. To deliberately bleed off pressure. To risk decompression sickness, or worse, exposure to vacuum if I misjudged the balance. Training had warned us again and again, never tamper with the suit pressure in open space. And yet now it was the only option left. I said it aloud, half to Pavel, half to myself. I must reduce pressure manually. The line went silent for a moment, and I imagined his expression inside the cabin, the horror, the calculation, the unwilling acceptance. Then he answered simply, do it carefully. Stay in control. You must come back. I looked down at the earth one last time, brilliant and indifferent below me, then at the stubborn circle of the hatch. My gloves trembled as I reached for the valve. My entire body screamed at me not to do it, not to risk bursting my lungs, not to tempt fate with such recklessness. But the alternative was certain death. I turned the valve. At once, I felt the suit collapsing against me, pressing down on my chest like a giant fist. My breathing grew shallow, and the dizziness came in a sudden wave. I fought the urge to close my eyes. I tightened the valve again to hold the new pressure. It was barely enough to keep me conscious, but now, for the first time in endless minutes, my arms began to move again. My shoulders flexed. My legs bent. The impossible suddenly became possible. I forced myself toward the hatch again. This time, I felt my body slide against the rim instead of jamming solidly in place. I knew it would still take everything I had left, but there was a chance. The moment I reduced the pressure, the sensation was terrifying. The suit that had felt like an iron cage just minutes before suddenly collapsed inward, gripping my body in strange, uneven ways. My chest felt compressed, my breathing became shallow, and a wave of dizziness spread through my head. I knew exactly what was happening. By lowering the internal pressure too much, I was exposing myself to the risk of decompression sickness and even embolism. The nitrogen in my blood could form bubbles, my joints could lock in agony, and I could lose consciousness without warning. I had seconds to decide whether I would hold the valve steady or turn it back. If I chose to restore pressure, the suit would balloon again, and I would never fit inside. If I chose to keep it low, I might collapse before I reached the airlock. I forced myself to hold it. With the suit slightly softer, I tried to bend my knees. For the first time since the walk had begun, they responded, awkwardly but enough. My elbows still felt stiff, but I could bring my arms closer to my chest. The next task was to approach the hatch again, this time with control rather than brute force. I pulled at the tether, kicked lightly, and rotated my body toward the ship. I saw the round outline of the airlock frame and concentrated on it as if it were the only thing in existence. My visor was covered in fog from sweat, but I wiped it with my glove and pushed forward. When I reached the rim again, I stopped to prepare myself. The previous attempts had left me exhausted, but now my movements were possible, if painful. I bent at the waist, forced my shoulders inward, and angled myself headfirst into the opening. The edges of the hatch pressed against my helmet and shoulders, but this time I did not bounce back completely. My torso squeezed through until I felt stuck again, halfway in, halfway out. I could hear my own strained breathing echoing inside the helmet, faster and shallower than I wanted. "Pavel," I called, my voice hoarse, "I am entering, but it is very tight." He answered calmly but urgently, "Do not stop. Push with everything you have. I will guide from here." His words steadied me. I forced my arms forward, twisted my body with all the strength I could summon, and pulled against the edges of the hatch. The pressure on my chest grew worse, and for a moment I thought I would suffocate before I made it through. My arms trembled, my legs kicked uselessly outside, but centimeter by centimeter, I advanced. At one point I felt the tether catch, and panic surged through me. If it snagged, I could be trapped outside even while my torso was inside. I froze, holding my breath, and tried to sense where the line was caught. Pavel's voice came again, sharper this time, "Move your left leg, Alyosha, the tether is under it." I shifted, felt the resistance ease, and then pulled forward again. It was like dragging myself through a steel ring that had no intention of letting me go. Finally my helmet cleared the inner edge of the hatch, and I collapsed into the airlock with half my body still hanging outside. For several seconds, I lay there gasping, sweat dripping into my eyes, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought the suit might shake with it. Pavel called to me again, "Are you inside?" I managed to answer, halfway. I must pull the rest. The exhaustion was overwhelming, but I knew I had to finish. I bent my arms again, tugged my hips forward, and finally felt my legs slide inside the airlock. Once I was fully inside, I wanted to lie there and rest, but there was no time. The outer hatch was still open, and we had to seal the airlock before I could repressurize. I fumbled with the controls, my hands clumsy and unresponsive, but eventually the mechanism engaged, and the hatch closed with a metallic finality that filled me with relief. Only then could I allow myself to breathe deeply again, though even that felt labored in the reduced pressure of the suit. "Status," ground control asked through the radio. My voice cracked as I replied, "Entered the airlock. Reducing exertion. Proceeding with repressurization." I heard voices of relief in the background, but they remained professional, asking about my physical condition. I admitted that I was overheating, drenched in sweat, and extremely fatigued. They acknowledged it and told me to remain calm until pressure equalized. The silence of the airlock as the atmosphere returned was one of the most welcome sounds I have ever experienced. The hiss of the air valves was steady, mechanical, but to me it felt like the breath of life itself. I felt the suit expand slightly again, but this time it did not matter. The chamber around me was filling with safe, breathable air. I closed my eyes and focused on every inhalation, telling myself that I had survived the worst. When the gauges finally indicated safe pressure, I opened the inner hatch and crawled into the cabin where Pavel sat waiting. He looked at me with an expression that was half relief, half disbelief. His face was pale, but his eyes were steady. "You made it," he said quietly. I could not answer immediately, I was still trying to recover enough strength to remove my helmet. When I finally pulled it off, the cabin air felt cool and clean compared to the suffocating heat inside the suit. I leaned back against the seat and let out a long breath I felt I had been holding since the moment I first floated out. The confrontation was over, but it had drained me completely. Every muscle ached, my vision swam with spots, and the sweat-soaked undergarments clung to me like a second skin. Yet in that moment, the discomfort no longer mattered. I was back inside, alive, and still part of the mission. Pavel reached out, squeezed my shoulder, and said, "Now we continue. There is still much to do." I nodded, unable to form words, but grateful beyond measure that I was there to hear him. Inside the cabin, I wanted nothing more than to collapse and let my body rest, but the mission did not allow for luxury. I had barely pulled off my helmet when Pavel reminded me that we still had to jettison the inflatable airlock and prepare for re-entry. The airlock had done its job, but it was now dead weight attached to the side of our spacecraft. If it stayed there, we risked an unstable descent and possible structural failure during the critical minutes of atmospheric entry. My hands were trembling as I reached for the controls, my fingernails white with the effort of gripping switches. Pavel watched me closely, ready to intervene if I faltered, but he also knew I had to complete my own sequence. The jettisoning process was supposed to be straightforward: seal the inner hatch, vent the chamber, and trigger the explosive bolts that would detach the airlock. In training, it was a routine checklist. Here, inside a capsule already hot from the sun and cramped beyond belief, nothing felt routine. Sweat continued to drip into my eyes, and my undergarments were soaked through, clinging uncomfortably against my skin. I felt like I had run several marathons in a row. Each motion required concentration, because any mistake with the explosive bolts could compromise our fragile shell. "Proceed step by step," Pavel reminded me. His voice was calm, but his eyes flicked constantly between me and the panels. He was making sure I did not skip anything in my exhaustion. I read the sequence aloud as I completed it: inner hatch locked, vent valve open, chamber pressure dropping, the hiss of the escaping air filled the cabin, and then silence. I pressed the button for the jettison. There was a dull thud that reverberated through the capsule, followed by the unmistakable sensation of separation. The airlock was gone. The ship shuddered briefly, then stabilized. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a second, but Pavel would not let me drift into fatigue. "Check oxygen reserves. Then report to ground." I forced myself upright and read the gauges. Oxygen was still within acceptable range, though mine had been depleted far more than planned. Ground control confirmed our readings and ordered us to rest as much as possible before re-entry. Rest was a strange word in that cabin. We had no real beds, only the seats, and the constant hum of equipment filled the air. Still, I allowed my body to sink into the harness, my muscles twitching from the strain they had endured outside. Sleep was shallow and uneasy. I awoke several times, disoriented, unsure if I was still outside the ship. Each time I looked around, the cramped walls reminded me of where I was. My heart pounded until I convinced myself that the danger of the EVA was past. But even then, another problem loomed ahead. Re-entry had always been the most dangerous phase of a flight, and we had been briefed many times about the risks: if the orientation failed, if the separation sequence did not go correctly, if the parachutes malfunctioned, there would be no rescue. We had no ejection seats in Voskhod, too, no way to escape. The following day, as we prepared for descent, I noticed the cabin temperature climbing again. The environmental system was not regulating as it should. We were both sweating heavily, our bodies constantly on edge. Pavel looked at me and smiled faintly, though it was more to reassure me than from any true comfort. "We did not come here for comfort, Alyosha," he said. I laughed despite myself, my throat dry, my voice hoarse from hours of speaking through the radio. The truth was we were dangerously dehydrated. Our water supply was limited, and we had rationed it to the bare minimum. Every breath felt thick, as if my lungs were working harder than they should. Ground control gave us the final sequences for re-entry. We strapped ourselves in, tightened every restraint, and checked the instrument panels repeatedly. The orbit correction burn was executed, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of deceleration, my body pressing against the seat. The separation of modules was next. This was supposed to be automatic, but the system failed. Instead of a clean detachment, the equipment module remained partially connected to the descent module by tangled cables. The ship began to spin, not violently at first but enough to press my head sideways against the headrest. "Failure of separation," I reported. "The modules are not clear." Ground control was quick to answer, their tone clipped and urgent. "Hold steady. The cables will burn through in atmosphere. Maintain orientation if possible." That instruction was easier given than followed. As we descended, the spin worsened, and I saw the control dials flickering, the horizon indicators swinging wildly. My stomach lurched, and I clenched my teeth against the sensation of being thrown around inside a metal ball. Pavel's voice cut through the noise. Keep your eyes on the gauges, Alyosha. Ignore the motion. I tried, but every rotation pulled my vision to the side, and the sweat in my eyes blurred everything further. For several endless minutes, we tumbled through the upper atmosphere, the ship groaning from the strain. I wondered if the hull would hold, if the bolts would tear loose under the asymmetric drag. Then, with a jolt and a loud metallic snap, the modules finally separated cleanly. The tumbling eased, though the G-forces pressed us deep into the seats. My chest felt like a weight was crushing it, my ribs straining, but I forced myself to keep reporting data. Ground control kept asking for status, their voices calm, almost detached, but I could hear the intensity under their words. The heat shield was working, but the cabin grew even hotter, the smell of burning insulation seeping inside. My tongue was dry, sticking to the roof of my mouth. Breathing was shallow and painful. Pavel muttered, half to himself, almost through. Hold on, Alyosha. I gripped the armrests until my knuckles were white. The roaring of re-entry filled the capsule, a constant vibration through every surface. Finally, the G-forces lessened, and I felt the weight lift slightly from my chest. I gasped for air, my vision spotted with darkness from the strain. The parachute deployment sequence had begun, but even here, we held no illusions. If the parachutes failed, there would be no recovery. The first jerk came as the drogue deployed, then another violent pull as the main chute opened. The descent stabilized, and for the first time since separation failure, I allowed myself to believe we might survive. But even as the parachute held, a new problem awaited. We were off course, far off, drifting toward dense forests and mountains. The landing would not be the gentle touchdown the planners had promised. The parachute held, but it quickly became obvious that our descent path had taken us far from the designated recovery zone. Instead of the flat plains prepared for landing, we were drifting toward a thick expanse of forest that stretched endlessly in every direction. I craned my neck against the harness straps and saw nothing but treetops beneath us, dark green stretching like an ocean of needles. It was Siberia, and from our altitude, I knew it would not welcome us gently. I exchanged a look with Pavel, and he nodded as if to confirm what we both knew. We were going down in the taiga, and nobody on the ground had any immediate idea where we would land. The impact came faster than I expected. The descent module crashed through trees, branches scraping violently against the metal shell, each strike sending jolts through my spine. The final thud was brutal, throwing my head forward and tightening the straps around my chest. The capsule tilted sharply, then came to rest at an angle. For several moments, we both sat stunned, breathing heavily, ears ringing from the noise of the impact. The silence that followed was broken only by the creak of metal cooling and the rustle of branches against the hull. I unstrapped myself slowly, testing my limbs, half expecting sharp pain, but aside from bruises and exhaustion, I was intact. Pavel did the same, and soon we were both crouched in the cramped space, helmets off, listening to the unfamiliar stillness outside. I was the first to speak. We are alive. But we are alone. Pavel looked at the instruments, though they offered little comfort now. Yes, alive. Ground does not know our exact position yet. It may take them time. We must be ready. His words carried weight because we both understood what it meant. We were stranded in sub-zero temperatures, deep in the Siberian wilderness, with wolves and bears known to roam the forests, and our supplies were limited. When ground control finally reached us over the radio, their relief was audible. I reported our status clearly: landing successful. Crew uninjured. Location uncertain. Forest terrain. They acknowledged, but their instructions were vague. Rescue teams had been dispatched, but they admitted it could take hours, possibly longer, to reach us. I glanced at Pavel, and he raised an eyebrow. We both knew longer in Siberia could mean a night, or two, or more. As daylight began to fade, the temperature dropped noticeably inside the cabin. The small heaters struggled, and our sweat-soaked undergarments from the EVA and re-entry made us shiver uncontrollably. Pavel spoke first, quietly but firmly. If they do not reach us tonight, we must think like survivors, not like cosmonauts. There are wolves here, and the cold will be worse than hunger. His tone was matter-of-fact, but I could hear the tension beneath. I nodded, forcing myself to think pragmatically. We cannot leave the capsule yet. It is our only shelter. But if the temperature continues to drop, we must prepare. The hours passed slowly, darkness outside pressing against the small porthole. We spoke little at first, each of us absorbed in our own calculations of what could go wrong. Finally, Pavel broke the silence with a question that surprised me. Did you think you would die out there, during the walk? His voice was quiet, almost casual, but his eyes fixed on me. I took a breath before answering. Yes. When I could not fit back inside, I believed it was the end. I thought you would have to seal the hatch and return alone. I saw his jaw tighten as he listened. After a pause, he said, I would not have closed it. I looked at him sharply, but he did not waver. I would not have left you. We would have faced it together. The words hit me with unexpected force. I had never doubted his loyalty, but hearing it spoken so plainly in that frozen forest brought a strange calm. Later, when the cold became unbearable, we pressed ourselves closer in the cramped cabin, conserving what body heat we could. My teeth chattered, and Pavel tried to distract me with talk of the future. When we return, they will celebrate you as the first man to walk in space, he said, his breath visible in the freezing air. I shook my head. They will not know how close it was to disaster. They will hear only success. He chuckled softly, a dry laugh. That is how it always is. The world wants heroes, not men drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. I found myself smiling in spite of the misery. He was right. Outside, I had been seconds from losing consciousness, and yet already the story was being polished into triumph. By the second night, the situation grew even more desperate. Our clothing was still damp, the heaters inadequate, and the forest around us echoed with distant howls. Wolves, unmistakable, circling somewhere in the dark. We exchanged no words then, but the sound sharpened our resolve. We checked the pistol included in the survival kit, a standard issue but never before truly expected to be used. Pavel inspected the cartridges carefully, then set it within reach. The atmosphere inside the capsule was heavy, not with fear alone but with the acceptance that we were now reduced to the simplest struggle, to last long enough for rescue to find us. Before trying to rest again, Pavel looked at me and spoke one final time that night. If this is how it ends, at least we did something that mattered. His words were not grand, not heroic, simply factual, but they carried weight. I replied quietly, my throat raw from dryness, it must not end here. Too much depends on us returning. He nodded, and then we both closed our eyes, though sleep was fitful and broken by shivers. In those hours, I realized that space itself had not frightened me as much as the Earth now did. The void outside the capsule had been silent and merciless, but predictable. The forest was alive, shifting, full of unknowns. Between the cold, the predators, and the uncertainty of rescue, it was a different kind of trial. The conversation we shared, brief and stripped of all formality, was less about courage and more about acceptance. We had already faced death above the planet. Now we had to face survival on it. Morning brought no rescue. When pale light seeped through the small porthole, it revealed nothing but dense forest stretching in every direction. The capsule was half buried in snow from the night, the air inside bitterly cold, and our clothing still damp. My muscles ached from shivering, and my mouth was dry from breathing the thin, chilled air. Pavel was already awake, his eyes fixed on the survival kit spread out in the cramped cabin. He handed me a piece of chocolate, brittle from the cold, and said simply, "We must move soon." I chewed it slowly, the sugar sharp against my tongue, and tried to gather strength. Ground control finally managed to triangulate our approximate location, but their message was not what we hoped for. Helicopters had attempted to reach us at dawn, but the forest was too dense. They could not land, and even lowering men on cables was judged too dangerous. The only option was to send rescue teams on skis, which meant more hours, possibly another night, before contact. The words crackled through the radio, and when the message ended, silence filled the cabin again. Pavel sighed, adjusted his coat, and said what we were both thinking: we cannot sit here waiting like targets. We prepare a camp outside. Exiting the capsule was an ordeal of its own. The hatch had frozen overnight, and it took the combined force of both of us pushing and kicking to finally break it free. The cold air rushed in, sharper and harsher than inside, and I instantly felt it on my face like knives. Snow covered the ground around us, waist-deep in places, and the trees loomed tall and unforgiving. The silence was broken only by the occasional crack of branches under their own weight and the distant, unsettling howl of wolves. Pavel pulled himself out first, sinking almost immediately to his knees in the snow. I followed, every muscle complaining, but there was no choice. We began dragging equipment from the capsule. The survival kit contained a small collapsible axe, a pistol with spare cartridges, a portable stove, and limited rations. With the axe, we set to work cutting branches. Each swing felt heavier than the last, my arms still weak from the spacewalk and the re-entry, but we forced ourselves onward. Soon we had gathered enough to form a crude shelter against the side of the capsule, using branches to insulate against the wind. It was primitive, but already the act of building gave us a sense of control over our situation. Pavel struck a fire with the stove, feeding it twigs and bark until flames licked upward. The sight and smell of smoke in the frozen wilderness felt almost unreal. We sat by the fire as dusk approached, wrapped in layers of whatever clothing we had, trying to dry our soaked garments. Steam rose faintly from the fabric as it hung near the flames. The warmth on my face was almost painful at first, my skin stinging as the blood returned. Pavel stared into the fire for a long time before speaking. "This is not what we trained for. They prepared us for vacuum, for failure of engines, for radiation storms. Not for this." His voice carried no bitterness, only observation. I answered quietly, "And yet here we are. Alive because we can still swing an axe and light a fire." He looked at me and nodded. That night was worse than the first. The wolves came closer, their howls circling us in the darkness. At one point, I thought I heard branches snapping under heavy paws not far from camp. I reached for the pistol, clutching it in my hand until dawn, every sense strained for movement in the shadows. Pavel barely slept either, and when morning finally came, both of us looked years older. Yet the fire had held through the night, and that small victory kept us going. On the third day, the first sign of rescue arrived. We heard distant voices, faint at first, carried by the wind. Then the crunch of skis over snow, rhythmic and deliberate. I stood, shouting until my throat hurt, and soon several figures emerged from the trees, bundled in heavy parkas, rifles slung over their shoulders. They approached with a mixture of caution and awe, as though unsure whether they were meeting cosmonauts or ghosts. One of them raised his arm in greeting and said, "We found you." Those words, simple and unadorned, were the most welcome of my life. The ski patrol carried additional supplies, warm clothing, food, and equipment to set up a more secure camp. But evacuation was still impossible by helicopter due to the dense forest. Instead, we would have to wait until a landing zone could be cleared, which meant more days in the taiga. Together with the rescuers, we expanded the camp, felled trees, and built a larger fire. The work was exhausting, but for the first time, I felt safe. Surrounded by others, with rifles ready and the fire blazing high, the forest seemed less hostile. When the helicopter finally arrived, days later, the sound of its blades cutting through the air brought every man to his feet. The clearing had been prepared, the snow packed down, and the machine settled awkwardly among the trees. Pavel and I were guided toward it, our bodies weak from days of cold and rationed food, but our spirits unbroken. As I climbed aboard, I looked back at the capsule, half buried in snow, and thought of how it had nearly become our tomb. The flight back to civilization was strangely quiet. Reporters and officials would later call the mission a triumph, the first spacewalk in history, proof of Soviet strength. They would not speak of the suffocating suit, the uncontrolled spin, the crash in the forest, or the night surrounded by wolves. Those details were hidden, classified, and replaced with polished phrases. But for Pavel and me, the truth was etched into every scar, every shiver, every memory of those days. I learned something fundamental in that forest. Space had tested my body, but Earth had tested my will. The glory of walking in space meant little when I was crouched by a fire, pistol in hand, listening to predators circle. Survival was not about flags or speeches. It was about endurance, about refusing to yield when everything pressed against you. When I finally stood before the cameras, smiling in my uniform, I carried that truth silently inside me. The mission had made history, but it had also nearly ended it. And only Pavel and I knew how thin that line had been.